I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Today I'm going to be talking about some information that will help us understand how it is that we got to where we are. It's always important to look at the news. And in today's news, we have reports of NASA hiring multiple dozens of theologians and writers in different religious traditions to discuss what would be the reaction on the part of the population when they talk about the next big discovery or alien life. Now, NASA has put out these kinds of reports and these kinds of claims for decades. In fact, it goes all the way back into the 1960s when there was a Brookings Report Institute done for NASA. And if you don't know, Brookings is one of the top think tanks out there. They help to craft policy. They help to come up with geopolitical strategies, techniques, as well as the Rand Corporation, which we're going to get to here in a moment. But they talked about the effect that it would have on the public when they announce that there's alien extra biological life. And I believe, as you know, I've covered this many times. We've done multiple segments here in the fourth hour on how I think this is a big scale deception. And one of the reasons I think that is that if you go back to that 1968 Brookings Report Institute discussion of the topic of alien life, they point out, they admit that the Christian religion, quote, would be particularly compromised by the discovery of alien life, since it makes such a deal of the incarnation of Christ in history and the historical event, and the knowledge of Christ's passion, ascension, and atonement would then be brought into question. This would be irreconcilable with the doctrine of alien life. And funny, because I covered that in my book multiple years ago, back in Esoteric Hollywood 2, the sequel. And so I was talking about how, Hollywood, the alien movies have been talking about this for so long, and they're really just prepping us for this. And even to my surprise, when that World Economic Forum video came out 5 years ago, when it was the 10 things to expect in the next 10 years or 8 things, whatever it was, and they talked about alien life being one of the things that Klaus and his crew said would be to come, said to expect within the time period of 2020 to 2030. Alien life, the announcement of alien life. And we've also seen Klaus in different talks talking about synthetic biology. We're going to change you. We're going to be in your body. And my suspicion, this is just my analysis, my theory, is that they will try to tie this into a new origin of myths, or excuse me, a new myth of origins, a new life science origins relating to alien life. And if you read that article there on Western Journal about this whole announcement from NASA, they even go into talking about people from Oxford, people from Cambridge, people from different religious traditions talking about how, maybe it's really what the Jesuit Luciferian Teilhard de Chardin said, a kind of convergence of all the world religions and of all science and religion into one new thing. And Christianity really would have to kind of compromise and fit into this new scenario. That's what the Brookings Report Institute said back in the 60s. So what's in the news today, it was actually in the think tanks, 50, 60 years ago. Now, why is that? Why do we have these ideas that are seeded 50, 60 years ago, seeded oftentimes through fiction, through movies especially, and it's propaganda. It's what I've covered in my books, it's what I cover a lot in terms of culture creation. Culture creation. Where does this come from? Why do we have the idea of culture creation? Well, it's the old ancient world's idea of mythology, right? We have the notion of myths that the poet, that the bard, that the philosopher, the Homer, the storyteller, right? Even Plato told these kinds of myths that were intended to teach the society and train the society to go in a certain direction. Sometimes the myths were true in terms of the principles behind them, the archetypes, in a Carl Jung type of sense. Sometimes the myths are completely fabricated and they're intended to deceive, inveigle, and obfuscate, right, the population, and get them to believe the myth of the state, to worship the state as God, etc. So the state has always seen a necessity to having a noble lie, a myth. In today's world, even though we think of it as highly scientific, highly pragmatic, highly technical, is just as, if not more so, engineered via mythology, via technocratic inducement to belief, or religious engineering on the part of social engineers and psychological warfare experts. We've been covering this for a long time. I've covered this just this last week. I did a whole 2-hour lecture on the totality of MK Ultra, from all the research and the new stuff that I've uncovered in the last 6 months relating to just how much continues to come out about those projects. Now, when we get to, excuse me, the RAND Corporation, this is, of course, the brainchild of the Air Force. This comes out of people like Curtis LeMay, and the idea of creating a giant think tank that could really war game the new world that we're going into. Since we're going into a technocratic future world, they just sort of decree, we're going to need thinkers, we're going to need mathematicians and quants, they were called. That is technocratic mathematics-obsessed spurgs, basically leading us into this new world order. And how could they engineer not just America, but the whole world into this new order? And this is where the social engineering comes into play with changing the American landscape. There's a great book. Alex actually did a documentary many, many years ago interviewing the author of Soldiers of Reason, Alex Abaya, in his classic treatment. Now, this is kind of an establishment okay treatment. It's kind of like, we're going to allow this guy in. We're going to let him publish the first sort of public analysis and records analysis of the RAND Corporation from the vantage point of a journalist. So even this sort of whitewashed report is amazing in what it admits, right? Because as we've seen over and over and over in my Global Elites lecture series, when we read the books of these guys, especially in the last 100 years, they really tell us everything. They don't hold anything back. It's all put out there, and just on the table. They lay down all their cards, and I believe that they do that precisely because it's a kind of a strategy. You could liken it to gaslighting, but you could just say that it's hidden in plain sight to really just condition people and get them used to it. So the Air Force set this up as a kind of post-World War II era Cold War think tank. And the Cold War, as I more and more come to discover and research, was really a managed dialectic. I don't believe everybody in the Cold War was a bad guy. I'm not saying everybody on the espionage level of the Cold War was a bad person or participating knowingly in a lie. A lot of people were going along with things that they didn't see the full, 50-year projections plans at that time. So they didn't know any better. I had family members who, were Cold War people, and they thought they were really fighting the evil Soviet Empire. And the Soviets were an evil atheist empire. But what has come out in recent decades is that there was a lot of exaggeration of the threats from these foreign enemies, these foreign powers, these foreign power blocks. And that was intentionally hyped up by the CIA, by the OSS, to bring us into a Cold War. And so the Marshall Plan and that kind of stuff, this sort of kicks off the era of the Cold War, which a lot of analysts say is World War III. And you're going to see why the Cold War is so important, because this is where the RAND Corporation really steps into the fore to change the American landscape into something different. And really, you could say that mutually assured destruction, the whole idea of the Cold War, comes out of the RAND Corporation's strategies. And it's not for just winning a battle. It's not for us being the good guys versus the bad guys. It's a long-term strategy to bring in, well, first of all, to change the idea of what America is out of a protectionist, isolationist country that is a production-based economy, literally to turn it into the policeman of the world and into a consumer economy. So we had to undergo decades of bombardment of, guess what, fear. And this is really what Kubrick is lampooning in something like Dr. Strangelove. It's a great example, a satirical approach to how the Cold War took us into the technocracy. That's where we are now. We are in the era of long-term, decades, century-long planning to get us into this technocratic world order that couldn't have happened if we had not had this managed dialectical conflict of thesis, antithesis, synthesis of two materialistic, atheistic power structures and philosophies, that is Rand, Ayn Randian style capitalism, monopoly capitalism versus Soviet style communism. And the smashing of these two together is a kind of nuclear explosion, leading us into the synthesis in the Hegelian philosophy of dialectics, which is the new third option, which is the you could say it is the technocratic synthesis of these two things. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Be sure and support the tip of the spear in the InfoWar by going to the InfoWar store getting all the supplements that you need, as well as the other DVDs and other materials there that really help fight against the tyranny that is just exploding. But there's also a mass awakening. So there's a lot of positive things that are happening. Now, we were talking about the history of the Rand Corporation, and I was getting to the fact that really the whole Cold War was dreamt up, really engineered by the so-called neocons, as they were. Well, they're neocons, but they're not really conservatives at the Rand Corporation. And the reason I'm going after the neocons here is not because I think that they're, necessarily running everything, although they kind of did eventually get the upper hand and kind of went out. We saw, for example, Obama and people like this really just eventually going into the neocon camp. A lot of people talked about Hillary basically being a neoconservative, and the reason for that is that the original neoconservatives at the time of Rand Corporation, they combined a weird strategy of Trotskyite, neo-Trotsky philosophy of red terror and fear with Leo Strauss's kind of top-down fascist model. So it's a weird mix of terror and fascism, and that's precisely the model Rand is the corporate fascist structure. And I'm saying fascist in the true sense here, not the way that woke people misuse it. The idea of running all of society on the basis of mathematics quantification. This is an old Plato idea. You've heard me talk about this many times in the fourth hour, and that's really what the Rand strategists developed here. And they decided that they could bring into play all of these fear tactics. This is the key that I'm trying to get across here, is that what they mastered was from red terror, adopting the notion of fear on a mass global scale. And this is what the Cold War was, especially all of the continued pressure of nuclear war, nuclear threats. And you could debate how real that was in terms of what capabilities the Soviet Union really had at the time. But regardless, the nowadays analysis is it's admitted that a lot of this was hyped up. It was exaggerated on the basis of things like NSC 68, which said that we've got to move America into a global strategy of beyond containment and into outright mutually assured destruction, straight up Cold War. And so this occurred, and this really kicked Rand into gear. And amazingly, Rand started talking about what would have to happen to change America into not just a global police force, but a consumerist nation, move it away from a production economy, where production goes to places like China, right? And we become a service-based economy. We become a economy that completely shifts, and it's going to take many, many decades, obviously, for this to have its full effect, which we're in now. We are now in the phases of Great Reset, is what the culmination of these old Rand plans was to bring us to this fear-based, austerity-based collapse situation where you have a year zero. Where do we get year zero from? Great Reset, right? That comes from the Jacobins. In the French Revolution, the Jacobins, the radical Illuminati faction in the French Revolution, they believed that they could reset all of society. They were original pioneers of a reset. And the idea would be that you could have a totally new system laid over on top of that. And you could even give new holidays, right? Fake made up holidays like Thermidor and all these weird things that these communists had made up. But they were early predecessors to technocracy. And later, people like Auguste Comte, Saint-Simon, philosophers like Giuseppe Mazzini, a lot of these communists were really people who wanted to have a technocratic order. And so a lot of the corporate elite and the banking elite saw commonality there. They believed that they had the same ultimate end goal. So what I'm trying to explain is that although on one level, it's true that people that are collectivists, people that are Marxists, that are socialists, are in opposition to their dialectical opponents of the Adam Smith, Ayn Rand, hardcore capitalist models. One thing that Rand noticed was that they would have to smash these two ideas together to produce the result, the synthesis, which is technocracy. And that's where we are. It is so obvious that what we have in today's society is the result of this conflict that was really managed and steered. Again, there was a lot of people who were really fighting each other. There was a lot of real espionage going on between Soviet spies and the CIA and all this kind of stuff. But really, this global conflict had a long-term secret goal. And oddly enough, certain movies actually capture this idea. Believe it or not just 2001, which you've seen me deconstruct. I've done many analyses, many even documentary analysis of Kubrick's 2001. There's a sequel that's lesser known, that was lesser popular, that's actually about the very thing I'm talking about today, 2010. And 2010 is not the best movie. It's kind of boring, but where it goes in the philosophy of the film, what Arthur C. Clarke, who was in the circles of these illuminists and these technocrats, he was actually writing those novels about the very types of plans that I'm talking about, what they had in store for that long-term, 21st century strategy of bringing in the new fourth industrial revolution, the new society. And what that film presents is a world where the Cold War gives rise to the discovery of what? Alien life and the implementation of technocracy. And at the end of the film, spoiler alert, it's not a big giveaway to spoil this boring movie, but at the end of this boring movie, you have the idea that the AI is basically the aliens, and they're planting life on new planets under the banner of Lucifer. And they talk about themselves as children of the sun, right? We are the children of the sun. And there's these weird prophecies and predictions about going into the planet, into the universe, and planting life on new planets. And so we kind of become our own creators. We're the alien panspermia people who spawn the life on other planets with the aid of the black monolith cube, which is AI, right? I'm not saying all that's necessarily true. I'm just saying that the philosophy of the film and of the novel is precisely that the Luciferian model of technocracy is not just to bring about a world government, it's actually to become post-human. That's the message of the movie. And in 3000, which is the third one, it's actually the full-on transhumanism where they merge with the AI or the alien entities. In that story, aliens are basically AI, so they kind of merge the two. And you could look at something like the Childhood End as well as another example of this. So how are we getting between aliens and technocracy and Cold War? Well, if we go back again to the Rand studies, one thing that they noted was that they could actually further in their plans by scaring the crap out of everyone through the notion of global destruction. So at that time, it was the bomb, it was the Soviet Union, ICBMs, right? That was the global destruction. And then we know, as we get a few decades ahead of this, the Club of Rome comes up with the idea of pollution and the environment being the great threat. If we're all going to die, we're all going to be destroyed. Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence are in this new movie, Don't Look Up, which is about how the scientists are going to save us, but Earth is actually going to just blow up from a meteor because we don't listen to the science. And there's basically a whole Trump sort of crowd of people that are the people that say don't look at science. And the whole world gets blown up because nobody listens to science. These are the kind of propaganda strategies that are dreamt up at places like the Rand Corporation. That's what I'm trying to get at. And that movie is precisely about that, right? It's about scaring everybody, and everybody who doesn't listen to science is a dumb Trump supporter and all this kind of stuff. And the irony is that it's actually the opposite. That's usually how propaganda works, is that you do the opposite, right? Don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to get deeper into this Rand Corporation secret. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Now, early on in the book, one of the things that Alex Abeyta discusses is the Gaither Report and the rise of the technocracy, the military-industrial complex, the very things that everybody knows about from the Eisenhower speech that he warned about. He was warning about the things that were being discussed at the Rand Corporation. And remember, they had known and planned the world government far before the Rand Corporation came into being, right? This goes back to at least the time of the technocrats of the French Revolution, and afterwards the French socialist technocrats. And you could argue even further back to just the idea of world empires. But when we notice the strange parallels between what the technocrats were saying back at the time of the Rand Corporation, what we're seeing people like Gates and Klaus Schwab and these people say now publicly, is that it's a common continuity of agenda plan. Going back, the Gaither Report noted that it was time to bring in a global order on the basis of a technocratic AI-run, basically computerized society, automation, the very same thing that I showed you in the Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars document the last time we did a fourth hour. Participants in this Gaither report included the Ford Foundation, it included the National Security Council, it included multiple other corporate entities, basically getting together and discussing in coordination with the RAND Corporation how to engineer society into this new order. And they literally call it a new world order of a one-party technocratic system worldwide that would eventually merge the United States and the Soviet Union. This is oftentimes called the third way. And this was popular terminology back at the time of Bill Clinton and in the 90s. And I don't think that terminology is really used anymore, but that's really what the end goal was of the Cold War on the part of a lot of these RAND Corporation strategists and as on the part of a lot of the Council on Foreign Relations strategists. In fact, there was a huge heated debate in the CFR back in the day about whether or not they could blend the two together into a new technocratic world government. And again, I'm just pointing out, do you not understand that this is where we are now? These dreams are now being realized. This was not a conspiracy theory. This is a public academic work on the history of the brainchild behind the Cold War, the RAND Corporation. Now, does that mean that everybody that worked there, that everybody in these groups is evil? I'm not saying that, no. And again, this whole system functions on the basis of compartmentalization. And a lot of people in various operations and groups like the military, they don't know what's going on in the big picture. They just think that I'm fighting for Uncle Sam for the good of the country. You're not. You're ultimately fighting for a super 0.001% technocratic elite who is manipulating you into dying for Pepsi, vaccines, abortion, right? Women's rights in other countries. That's what you're actually dying for, the global technocratic order. And they have at their disposal an army of the woke people who work for them. As I think everybody who listens to this audience actually knows that, right? The woke people are not the real woke people, right? The people that in this audience are the real woke people who are trying to explain what's really going on. And then you have this army of these mobs of what Jacques Attali calls the tip of the spear of transhumanism, right? The transhumanists are the tip of the spear of the New World Order, he says. But the real magic, I guess you could say, of the RAND Corporation was in not just fear, but engineering what they called the cult of the individual. They actually pioneered this idea, and the notion was that if we took the philosophy of the selfish motivations of any individual, what if we maximalized that idea for the population and then got the population into a rabid consumer philosophy for many decades? What effects would that have on the society? And one thing they learned from studying other countries where they run these programs and models, like in Egypt and in Syria under Miles Copeland. Miles Copeland, in his book Game of Nations, talks about when they implemented these strategies of industrialization and Western liberalism and neoliberalism and marketing Hollywood stuff to people, is that the country's population immediately started going down. And so they learned that the more that they pumped in Hollywood, the more they pumped in the stuff, it led to sterilization in the society, both voluntarily and nowadays non-voluntarily. That's what's going on now, right? So the idea was that if we weaponize, on the one hand, radical atomization on the part of the individual in terms of what they call game theory and rational choice theory, that the individual is always going to choose in their own self-interest. If they push consumerism to the maximum degree, then what that does is that actually fragments and destroys the society. At the same time, they pump in toxic culture, that is the Hollywood, the music industry. Not saying everybody in those industries is bad. I'm just talking about the propaganda element of those areas of society, basically weaponizing the arts in totality. Then what you get is a toxic stew. And that's precisely why the CIA, for example, in the Cold War, went and recruited French philosophers who were deconstructionists. Yes, postmodernists, recruited by the CIA to promote, under the guise of the Cold War, abstract art, ugly art, abominable art, because of the psychical effects on the society to break down meaning, the destruction of meaning, deconstructionism, critical theory. These are all real strategies and plans and schools of thought that they're not made up. They're not conspiracy theory. I went to a normal, regular university and I studied these people. Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas. These are real critical theorists who talk about deconstructing society. Now, they were a branch of Marxists. They're not Soviet bloc Marxists. They're a branch of Marxists called critical theorists. They were brought over by the OSS to help America win the war against the fascists and then win the Cold War. And how are they doing this? Through things like the Congress of Cultural Freedom, where the CIA spent all of this money funding the notion of abstract, degenerate, awful, garbage art and architecture. Why? To supposedly promote, quote, freedom, but all it does is have the opposite effect of destroying and degrading the society. And they were arguing, well, we have to do this. And this is all, again, the brainchild of people like the RAND Corporation, the CIA, the OSS, the think tanks, the Brookings Institute, the Carnegie Endowment, the Ford Foundation. It's all the same people, and it's all in this book. It's all admitted openly that, yes, they had this plan, that we have to change America radically so that, now at that time, the myth, the lie was so that America can win the Cold War, so that we can, and who was also another big figure in this? Brzezinski, Kissinger. We got to win the Cold War. The same people who are saying that they don't care about America. They're not loyal to any nation. They're internationalists. They don't going to care about America winning some Cold War. They want the technocratic world government. Brzezinski wrote the book, Between Two Ages, the technocratic era. You think he cared about America? The whole book is about, he doesn't care about America. America is intended to, like a snake, shed its skin and turn into this engine to bring in the New World Order. Now, I'm not saying that America's bad. There's a lot of great people in America. America's founding documents and ideology have a lot of great plans and strategies, a lot of rights of the individual, a lot of rule of law. These are all great things. But what I'm saying is that these people transitioned America into something else. And what we're going through in this country, especially in the last few years, is the battle to not become and turn into this global technocratic engine of the New World Order. And that's the battle that's being fought right now in this country. We are in the midst of the very thing that was planned decades and decades and decades ago. And the reason I keep harping on the old documents and 50, 60 years ago stuff is because we can't understand what we're fighting and how to fight it until we understand how we got here and what we're actually up against. And a lot of people might find this, disheartening, or, oh, well, we can't beat that. It's too much. All you have to do is recognize that it's a bunch of lies and it's a plan. That's it. That's number one. Once you see this, the fear, the same fear that was being pumped out nonstop in the Cold War is the fear that's being pumped out to you right now with all the lies about the COVID and all this nonsense. It's the exact same psychological strategy of fear. Fear, 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 fear. But what was the Cold War? Fear, 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 fear. Get under your desk when the nuke goes. Being under a desk isn't going to stop you if nukes are going off, right? This is just nonsense. It's crazy. Your desk is going to burn up, dude. You're not going to be safe underneath your desk. So there's not a global pandemic that's going to kill you. It's fraud. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. If you'd like to support my work, you can go to my website, jaysanalysis.com, and you can subscribe to get access to the lectures, to multiple years of me analyzing these big, fat, boring global elite books. We've done, 50, 60 of them now to date. One of them is, of course, the classic Alex Abea book, RAND Corporation. And you can also get signed copies of my books where I make this kind of accessible to people through an analysis of film, because one thing that Abea mentions in many places in his book is the fact that the RAND Corporation consulted and worked with a lot of directors, producers, a lot of Hollywood people to help put nuclear war, Cold War themes throughout Hollywood movies. And what this did was amp up the fear. So where did they get this idea? Well, because again, a lot of the people in this model are familiar with terror, red terror, and using that as a strategy for social engineering. So I mentioned the Gaither report and the military-industrial complex, and I mentioned the many corporate heads that were there at this committee meeting to discuss how to scare the crap out of everybody and how to make the notion of a global cataclysm acceptable so that everybody would just do whatever they're told, right? So, oh, look at the pictures of the house blowing up. If you don't do what we tell you, everything's just going to be a pile of ashes. And they put out all these movies. There was countless nuclear age atomic movies. There was The Day After, which scared the crap out of it. A TV movie. I think Steve Guttenberg's in it. It's pretty hilarious if you go watch it now. I recommend going and watching The Day After, because you watch it now, this is so obviously propaganda, which I think Reagan actually had a hand in saying we need to put out movies like The Day After. It might have been right before Reagan. I don't remember. Early 80s, maybe 82 is when that came out. But that was actually a propaganda film, part of an example of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. It was very popular. Where the Rockefeller Foundation, by the way, was also involved in this, ran at NSC 68, which was the idea of we got to absorb, or we got to kick this nuclear war off with, the Cold War off with this massive global fear campaign. Now, multiple examples of this have popped up. Obviously, any world war has an element, right? World War I, World War II has an element of global threat. But Abea notes that what was unique to the nuclear threat and the idea of anybody, any nation state getting a hold of nukes and being a rogue state was itself, under Bernard Baruch at the United Nations, a plan for global government and global policing. That's in Quigley as well. Quigley has a whole section, whole chapter on that. And so the problem with the nuclear threat thing is that that's the justification back in the 50s, 60s, 70s for, we've got to have the global government because Kim Jong-un, because Putin, anybody could just set off nukes, right? Everybody can just get nukes and set them off. So, we got to have a global government, right? And what was the basis of it? Videos of houses being mowed over by nuclear bombs, supposedly H-bombs, whatever. And that scared everybody. All of the schools, all of the boomers being told, get under your desk, stop, drop, and roll under your desk, because when the nuke comes, it's just so hilarious. It's not going to do anything. That was on purpose. They were doing those things in the schools. They actually funded as well. Rent Corporation came up with the idea of getting everybody to buy fallout shelters, because this would further the myth, the scaring people. I'm not saying it's bad to have an emergency shelter. I'm just saying that they promoted this idea to scare the crap out of everybody. Now, how does that relate to now? Well, go back to the mid to late 80s, and there was a new global campaign that started emerging. And there's a famous person that's in the news every day today that you might not know about, was involved in that global fear campaign. It's called the AIDS crisis. And Dr. Fauci was involved in studying, going around to bathhouses and researching the AIDS pandemic and how this scared people and how to get people to adopt medical ideas, medical ideology on the basis of fear campaigns. Is this not, can you not figure out what's happening? I mean, exactly what we saw there is being used now. Global fear campaign on the basis of, 3 years of this now? Little Kufid has just turned 3. So we have a troublesome toddler here, the terrible threes. COVID is now 3 years old. And it's really just an analog to not just the fears of the Cold War, the psychological warfare strategy of global fear, just like we see with the green agenda, the global fear behind pollution and overpopulation that the Club of Rome comes up with, the first global revolution. That's still being rammed through constantly. In fact, they even tied COVID and the lockdowns into that because, look at the Earth has healed. Mama Earth, Mammy Earth has healed through the global lockdowns. Now the birds are out. The fish are swimming again because of evil humans being locked down. And now they're pushing for climate lockdowns. And now what's in the news again, connections between COVID and AIDS, the autoimmune deficiency problems, the ADE problems. Now we might actually need something to do with AIDS viruses and new boosters, new immunity in regard to COVID and the shots. Interesting, because that's exactly what Fauci was doing, 20, 25 years ago. And if you remember the 80s and 90s, I remember you would see this all over the TV, right? It was all AIDS, everybody's going to have AIDS, everybody's going to die, just like the ozone hole. The ozone, we're all going to be cooked by 2015, everybody's cooked, right? Just like Inconvenient Truth. We're all going to be underwater. All of this is psychological warfare, social engineering, fear strategies. And it has nothing to do with what's true at all. None of it's true. All it has to do is getting you to comply. That's the only goal of any of that. Getting you to comply. And the compliance isn't really even necessarily about whether it's that's also a long-term goal. If you remember in lockstep, the compliance was about getting people to accept AI and automation. That's the longer-term goal of the compliance. Yes, there's the element of the initial rollout of all these stabbies and the boosters. The long-term goal is compliance into the technocratic world order. And in Klaus's book, in the last section of Fourth Industrial Revolution, he says that really the long-term goal is not just automation, but everything being tracked and traced and the changing of human biology. Now, again, this is my speculation. This is where I think the faux alien threat comes into play. And we don't know how they're going to use this, but they keep talking about it. It keeps popping up. You go back to the 1940s and 50s, the whole emergence of the alien UFO threat comes through science fiction writing. It comes through H.G. Wells. It comes through these books that the original crazy people who supposedly were abducted, Betty and Barney Hill, George Adamski, their stories are made up. In fact, it was exposed that their stories actually come from science fiction novels at the time. Go watch the documentary Mirage Men. It explains how a lot of the counterintelligence, basically the alien nonsense, is part of counterintelligence. They even interview the people who are involved in the counterintelligence operations to feed people nonsense and disinformation relating to aliens. That's a great documentary. And it doesn't get into the new agey sort of cult element to it. But if you know, of course, the CIA has a long history of studying and being involved in cults and alien cults. And why might this be? What's the commonality that we might see between studying alien cults, studying fear, global fear, social engineering, and pandemics, a new religion to replace biblical Western religions, Christianity, etc.? Well, it all works perfectly into this model of the New World Order, bringing people into the technocracy, giving them a new religious mythology, which the Hudson Institute documents talk about from the 60s, that's more compatible with technocracy. In Isaac Asimov's book's Foundation, Asimov, who was also hip to and in the inner circles of this technocratic New World Order plan, he has a front religion that the Foundation, which is this inner secret society of scientific elite, they know the true secrets to the what's really going on, which is really just implementation of a AI technocratic run government and tracking everybody through mass algorithms and so forth. But they have an outer religion that they've constructed that's a fake front for this technocratic core group. This is exactly what is coming. I'm telling you, this is the new narrative. This is what they're pumping. And I don't know when. I don't know. It might be 10 years. But most likely they're going to use an alien mythology, an alien lie. You can go back to George Adamski and see how from the very beginning, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, was actually threatening to sue anyone at the time who would question George Adamski's crazy story. Why would he do that? Because the CIA was behind this. They were involved in constructing this new mythology. It's the very perfect type of plan and strategy that the RAND Corporation themselves would cook up. How do we give people a new story, a new myth? Ooh, let's make it aliens. And the aliens are going to tell you, if you would only depop, just depopulate yourself, just go get the stabbies, just go get the brain chips, just enter into the metaverse, we will save you. That's literally what they tell people, right? This is the myth. This is the new story. It's obviously baloney. Don't fall for it. That's what I'm trying